Dead-end alleys in this city have a particular way of swallowing secrets. They are narrow, suffocating, and always seem to exist in a perpetual twilight, even when the sun is directly overhead. The alley leading to house number 44 was no exception. For 15 years, the neighbors walked past that rusted iron gate with their heads down, holding their breath. Not out of respect, but out of an instinctive fear of the silence that radiated from within. The story was always the same. The owner, a man named Mr. High, had fled in the dead of night to escape a mountain of gambling debts. He vanished, leaving nothing behind but a locked house and a neighborhood of whispers. Or so they said. It was a Tuesday afternoon, humid and sticky, when the silence was finally broken. Not by the return of the owner, but by a team of foreclosure agents and a locksmith. The bank had finally decided to reclaim the asset. The sound of the bolt cutters biting into the 15-year-old padlock echoed off the damp walls like a gunshot. Snap! Behind the shuttered windows of the adjacent houses, curtains moved. Eyes were watching. The good neighbors, the ones who claimed to know everything about everyone, were suddenly very quiet. They weren't watching out of curiosity. They were watching with the tense anticipation of people who knew that a grave was being disturbed. The locksmith, a young man wiping sweat from his forehead, pushed the heavy iron gate. It groaned, a high-pitched screech of metal grinding against rust that made everyone's teeth ache. He stepped up to the wooden main door. It was warped from years of rain and neglect. He expected resistance. He expected the heavy, dry smell of accumulated dust and rat droppings. That is what an abandoned house smells like. It smells like paper and dry earth. But when he forced the wooden door open, the air didn't drift out slowly. It rushed out, and the locksmith froze. It wasn't the smell of an empty house. It hit him and the two agents standing behind him like a physical blow. A thick, wet heaviness settled in their throats. It was a sickly sweet scent, cloying and dense, masking a sharp, metallic undertone. It was the smell of meat that had been left out in the heat, again and again and again. The young locksmith covered his nose, taking an involuntary step back, his face draining of color. I thought you said no one has been in here for 15 years, he choked out. The bank agent frowned, peering into the pitch-black living room where the afternoon light failed to penetrate. They haven't. The power was cut a decade ago. It's just mold. No, the locksmith whispered, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. He pointed a trembling finger toward the floor of the living room. There, on the layer of dust that should have been uniform and undisturbed, was a clear, sweeping mark, as if something heavy had been dragged across the floor recently. And right in the center of the room, sitting on a rotting wooden chair, was a porcelain teacup. It was filled with tea. And from where they stood, they could see a faint wisp of steam still rising from the rim. The house wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. As the rusty hinges groaned and finally gave way, the first thing that hit the locksmiths wasn't a ghost. It was the silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that had been accumulating for 15 years inside house number 44. Flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing a living room suspended in gray. Dust lay thick on everything: the velvet sofa, the cold screen of an old CRT television, the floorboards, like a layer of dirty snow. It was a tomb, untouched by the chaotic world outside. It smelled of stagnant time, dry rot, and a faint, sweet metallic scent that the brain tries instinctively to ignore. But as the beams of light swept across the center of the room, the men stopped. The logic of the runaway debtor theory shattered instantly. There, in the midst of the decay, was a dining table, and it was set for dinner. 2 placemats, 2 porcelain plates, silverware arranged with meticulous, almost military precision. In the center, a dried-out bouquet of roses, now black and brittle as coal, sat in a crystal vase. It wasn't the chaotic scene of a man packing his bags in a panic to flee from loan sharks. It was the scene of a man waiting for a lover, a moment frozen in anticipation. The investigator's eye, however, would have been drawn immediately to the floor near the host's chair. A wine glass lay shattered. Shards of crystal were scattered across the parquet. But here is the first anomaly, the first detail that feels wrong. There was no stain. If wine had been spilled during a struggle or a heart attack, the wood would have warped, stained dark red over a decade. But the floor was bone dry. The glass was clean. It was as if it had been smashed deliberately, dry, in a fit of cold, calculated rage. The group moved deeper, their boots leaving heavy prints in the dust.
One of the workers reached out to pull back the heavy velvet curtains, desperate to let some sunlight into this suffocating space. He froze. "Boss," he whispered, his voice trembling, "look at this." The windows weren't just latched, they were sealed. Layers of heavy, black industrial duct tape covered every seam, every crack where the frame met the wall. And here is the detail that turns a missing person case into a nightmare. The tape was applied from the inside. This wasn't a man trying to keep creditors out. Creditors knock. They don't seep through cracks in the window frames. This was a man trying to keep the air inside. Or perhaps he was terrified of what might get in. Who prepares a romantic dinner for 2, smashes a dry glass, and then hermetically seals their own home like a bunker? The police report from 15 years ago stated the owner fled the country. But standing in that room, looking at the black tape and the dead roses, the terrifying truth began to take shape. He didn't run. He was waiting. And whoever or whatever he was waiting for clearly arrived. 15 years is a long time. Long enough for rust to eat through iron, long enough for a child to become an adult, and certainly long enough for a neighborhood to bury its secrets. Let us blow the dust off the file labeled 2009. Who was Elias Blackwood? To the public, he was a ghost even before he vanished. A wealthy man, yes, but his wealth was the cold, isolating kind. He lived behind the heavy velvet curtains of the house at the end of the alley. He didn't wave to the children playing soccer in the street. He didn't buy raffle tickets for the local charity. He was a shadow in a window, a silhouette that people projected their own jealousies onto. When he disappeared one humid Tuesday in July, the narrative was almost too perfect. The neighbors, those smiling, helpful folks we met in the previous part, were all too eager to talk to the police back then. Their stories aligned with suspicious precision. He was drowning in debt, the grocer claimed. Gambling problems, whispered the lady from number 42. And the smoking gun? 3 separate witnesses swore they saw it, late at night, a black sedan idling at the mouth of the alley. Elias Blackwood, dragging a large, heavy leather suitcase, stepping into the car and driving away into the darkness. Case closed. A classic midnight run. A rich man fleeing his creditors to live out his days on a sunny beach somewhere with a fake name. The police accepted it. The neighborhood accepted it. The house was left to rot, a monument to a man who took the coward's way out. But recall what the locksmiths found just moments ago. We are standing in Blackwood's study. The air is thick, smelling of old paper and something sweeter, something decaying. The flashlight sweeps across the mahogany desk. It has not been touched in a decade and a half. Open the top drawer. There, resting neatly on top of a stack of unpaid electric bills, is a small, dark blue booklet. Close up, a U.S. passport. The photo shows a stern-faced Elias Blackwood. It is his passport. And here is the crack in the perfect story. If Elias Blackwood packed a suitcase to flee the country, if he planned to disappear forever, why did he leave behind the one document he couldn't travel without? He didn't forget it. A man running for his life doesn't forget his identity. Which leads us to a chilling realization. If Elias Blackwood never left this house, then who, or what, was in that heavy suitcase the neighbors saw being dragged away 15 years ago? Fade to black. Silence. The air inside the living room was heavy, stagnant, tasting of dry rot and old paper. 15 years of silence does something to a house. It creates a vacuum, sucking the life out of the walls until only the structure remains. To the naked eye, the scene was a perfect time capsule of a life interrupted. A thick, uniform layer of gray dust covered everything like a shroud, coating the mahogany coffee table, the cracked leather of the sofa, and the silent grandfather clock that had stopped at 3:15 a decade and a half. Forensic technicians moved through the gloom with practiced caution, their blue shoe covers whispering against the gritty floorboards. The beams of their flashlights cut through the darkness like scalpels, dissecting the shadows. They were looking for the obvious: blood spatter, a weapon, a note. But the room seemed determined to keep its secrets buried under that velvet layer of filth. Until the lead investigator, Lieutenant Graves, stopped near the armchair in the corner. It was the favorite spot of the missing owner, positioned to face the window, though the heavy curtains were currently drawn tight and pinned shut with rusted safety pins. Graves shined his light on the small round side table next to the chair. "Stop," Graves said. His voice was low, barely a rumble, but it froze the room. He pointed a gloved finger. In the sea of gray dust, there was a disruption, an anomaly. Lying squarely on the table was a newspaper. It wasn't yellow.
It wasn't brittle or curling at the edges like the magazines stacked by the television. It was white, crisp. The fold was sharp. Graves leaned in, his breath held tight in his chest. He didn't need to touch it to know what he was looking at, but he needed the confirmation. With a pair of tweezers, he lifted the corner of the front page. The date stared back at him in bold black ink, October 12th. A chill that had nothing to do with the drafty windows swept through the team. That date wasn't from 15 years ago. It wasn't even from last year. October 12th was exactly 7 days ago. The implication hit them with the force of a physical blow. This house, this abandoned tomb that the neighbors claimed to fear, hadn't been abandoned at all. Someone had been here, recently. They hadn't broken in. The dust on the floor showed a single, confident path from the back door to this chair. They hadn't come to loot. The silver candlesticks were still on the mantel. They had come here to sit, to relax, to read the morning news in the dark, surrounded by the smell of death, right in the middle of a room where a man had supposedly vanished into thin air. Graves looked around the suffocating room with new eyes. The silence suddenly felt predatory. The killer didn't run away 15 years ago. They didn't flee the country to escape debt. Whoever did this was comfortable here. They possessed a key. And more terrifyingly, they were likely still in the neighborhood, watching the police tape go up with the same calm detachment they had while reading that paper. The investigation just shifted gears. We aren't hunting a ghost anymore. We are hunting a visitor who feels right at home in hell. While the forensic team was still cataloging the suffocating air inside house number 44, a mix of old mold and that undeniable metallic scent of dried blood, the investigation shifted its gaze just 3 meters to the left, the house adjacent to the crime scene. Meet Mrs. Gable, 72 years old, a retired elementary school teacher with silver hair pinned back in a tight, sensible bun. To the neighborhood, she is the pillar of kindness. The woman who waters your plants when you are away. The woman who always seems to be watching from her porch, waving with a smile that never quite reaches her eyes. When the detectives knocked, Mrs. Gable didn't look surprised. She looked prepared. The atmosphere inside her home was a jarring contrast to the tomb next door. It smelled of lavender polish and peppermint tea. Every surface was cluttered with porcelain figurines, hundreds of glass eyes staring blankly at the visitors. Mrs. Gable was cooperative, perhaps a little too cooperative. In the interrogation recording, her voice is steady, soft, almost grandmotherly. She spent 20 minutes describing the missing homeowner, Mr. Blackwood, as a troubled soul, plagued by gambling debts. She painted a vivid picture of a man on the run. But when the detective steered the conversation to the night of the disappearance, November 14th, 15 years ago, the flow of information suddenly dried up. "Oh, that night?" she said, smoothing the fabric of her skirt. "It was storming terribly. I took my sleeping pills early. I saw nothing. I heard nothing." A perfect, convenient void in memory. But a seasoned investigator doesn't just listen to the words. They watch the silence, and they watch their hands. For the first half hour, Mrs. Gable's hands were as steady as a surgeon's. She poured tea without spilling a drop. She adjusted her glasses with precision. But the dynamic in the room shifted the moment the lead detective placed a small, rusted object on the table. A photograph of a keychain found inside Blackwood's hallway. "We know Mr. Blackwood was paranoid," the detective said, his voice low. "He never let anyone in. But we found records of a spare key made 2 weeks before he vanished. Did he give it to you, Mrs. Gable?" The silence that followed was heavy, thick, enough to choke on. Mrs. Gable didn't answer immediately. She reached for her tea, and there it was, a tremor, subtle but undeniable. The porcelain cup rattled against the saucer, clink, 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 a nervous rhythm betraying the calm facade. "Why would he give me a key?" she asked, her voice half an octave higher than before. She laughed, but the sound was brittle, like dry leaves being crushed. She denied it, but as she spoke, her eyes didn't meet the detective's. They darted to the wall, the shared wall, the thin layer of brick and plaster separating her cozy living room from the room where a man had sat dead in a chair for 15 years. Did she really sleep through that night, or has she been living next to a secret she helped lock away? As the police left, the camera on the dashboard caught one final detail. Mrs. Gable stood at her window, pulling the heavy velvet curtain shut. But before they closed, she wasn't looking at the police car. She was looking at the front door of house number 44. And for a split second, the sweet, elderly neighbor didn't look frightened. She looked relieved. Whatever Mrs. Gable knows, she has kept it buried for a decade and a half.
But fear has a way of making people slip, and that trembling hand was the first crack in the dam. The bookshelf was mahogany, solid, heavy. It stood against the north wall of the study like a sentinel, covered in a thick layer of gray dust that had settled undisturbed for 15 years. To the untrained eye, it was just a piece of abandoned furniture. But to the lead investigator, the physics of the room didn't add up. There were drag marks on the floorboards, faint, almost invisible scuffs that suggested this massive unit had been pushed into place, not just left there. It took 3 men to move it. The sound of wood grinding against concrete echoed through the silent house, a harsh, grating screech that seemed to protest the revelation of its secret. As the heavy shelf swung away, the air in the room shifted. A draft, cold and smelling of stagnant earth, seeped out from the wall. There was a door. It wasn't a hidden safe, and it wasn't a utility closet. It was a narrow, wooden door, painted the same pale cream as the wall, designed to disappear.
The handle had been removed from the outside. There was only a deadbolt installed to lock from the hallway. The investigator didn't open it immediately. He paused, letting the flashlight beam play over the keyhole. The metal was scratched, shiny around the edges, indicating it had been used frequently, frantically, a long time ago. When the bolt finally clicked back, the sound was like a gunshot in the quiet house. The door creaked open, revealing a descent into darkness. A basement. But it was what the flashlight revealed on the back of that door that made the team freeze. Scratches, hundreds of them, deep, jagged grooves gouged into the hard oak. They started low, near the floor, and clawed their way up to head height. Splinters of wood hung loose, preserved in the stale air. These weren't marks made by a tool. The spacing was uneven, the depth varying with desperation. These were made by fingernails. The investigator ran a gloved finger over the grooves. He could almost feel the panic, the raw terror of someone trapped in the dark, clawing at the only exit until their fingers bled. This wasn't a storage room. It was a cell. The narrative of the runaway debtor began to crumble right there in the doorway. People running from debt don't lock themselves in basements. They don't claw at the wood until the fibers tear. As the beam of light cut further into the gloom, it illuminated a small rusted bucket in the corner and a thin, filthy mattress. The air grew heavy, suffocating, laden with the realization of long-term confinement. Someone had spent days, perhaps weeks, down there, listening to the footsteps above, screaming into the silence. And the most chilling part? The neighbors, those kind people living just a wall away, claimed they never heard a thing. The house wasn't abandoned 15 years ago. It was a tomb long before the owner died. The question now wasn't where he went. The question was, who was the jailer that walked freely upstairs while the man below scratched his life away on the back of a wooden door? The air in the basement, it didn't just smell of mold and damp earth. It smelled of secrets kept far too long in the dark. For 15 years, the narrative surrounding the abandoned house at the end of the alley was simple, almost cliché. A desperate man drowning in gambling debts packs a bag in the middle of the night and vanishes. The neighborhood gossip fueled this story. It was easier to believe Mr. Blackwood was a coward running from loan sharks than to imagine what actually happened behind these peeling walls. But narratives, they tend to crumble when you look at the floorboards closely enough. During the excavation of the basement's dirt floor, an area the locksmiths initially refused to enter due to the overwhelming heaviness in the air, investigators found something. It wasn't a hidden safe. It wasn't a stash of stolen money. Under the flickering beam of the forensic flashlight, half buried in the clay, something glinted. A silver locket, tarnished, small, insignificant to the untrained eye. But to a detective, it was a screaming contradiction.
Inside the locket was a faded, water-damaged photo of a woman, Eleanor. She was a woman from the neighborhood who, coincidentally, vanished the very same week Blackwood did. At the time, the neighbors nodded knowingly, whispering over their fences that the two had eloped. A scandalous romance to escape their financial burdens, a romantic tragedy. However, the evidence at the scene paints a picture void of romance. The clasp of the necklace was not undone. It was snapped. The metal ring was twisted, suggesting it had been ripped from a neck with considerable force. And according to old police reports filed by Eleanor's estranged sister, this locket was her most prized possession, the one thing she would never, ever leave behind. If the locket was here, buried in the cold dirt of Blackwood's basement, then Eleanor never made it to the train station. Eleanor never ran away. Eleanor never left this house. The investigation has shifted. The file on the table is no longer just a missing debtor. The psychology of the crime has mutated.
This wasn't about money. The violence required to snap a silver chain suggests rage, obsession, possession. Suddenly, the silence of the neighbors feels less like ignorance and more like complicity. How could a struggle that broke a silver chain go unheard in such a thin-walled alley? Or is it that people simply hear what they want to hear? As the forensic team began to sift through the soil around where the locket was found, the lead investigator noted a disturbing pattern in the dirt. The earth wasn't just disturbed, it was packed down, layer by hard-packed layer. We came here looking for one missing man, but as the shadows lengthen in this basement, the horrifying reality settles in. We aren't looking for one body anymore. We are potentially standing on top of two. And the soil looks like it has been turned over more than once. Darkness is usually where secrets hide. But in the case of house number 44, the secret was hiding in plain sight, illuminated by a faint, flickering yellow light. Let's rewind the tape, not to the moment the locksmiths broke the door down, but to the quiet, uneventful nights over the last 15 years. The nights when the alley was asleep, and the only sound was the wind rattling the corrugated iron roofs. According to the initial police interviews, the neighbors described the house as dead, a concrete coffin abandoned by a debtor on the run. That was the official story. That was the comfortable story. But when investigators dug deeper into the neighborhood gossip, the kind whispered over morning coffee, not written in statements, a different pattern emerged. Several residents admitted reluctantly that they had seen things, small things. A man living directly across the street mentioned that occasionally, around 2 or 3 in the morning, he would see a dim glow coming from the second-floor window. It wasn't the steady shine of a lamp. It was erratic, unstable, like a candle struggling for oxygen, or a loose bulb swinging on a wire. "It's just old wiring," they said. "Probably a reflection from the street lamp," another claimed. "Maybe it's just rats chewing on the cables causing a spark." Notice the excuses? This is the most terrifying part of the investigation.
Not the crime itself, but the collective apathy that allowed it. The human brain is wired to rationalize the abnormal. When we see something that doesn't fit, like a light on in a house that has been empty for a decade, we don't think crime. We think glitch. We think short circuit. Because if we admitted that the light meant someone was inside, we would have to walk over there and knock. And nobody wanted to knock on the door of a man who supposedly fled from the mafia. So, for 15 years, 5,475 nights, the light flickered, and the neighborhood turned over in their beds, pulled the blankets up, and went back to sleep. They chose the comfort of a lie over the disturbance of the truth. But here is the detail that freezes the blood. When the crime scene technicians examined the electrical box in the basement of house number 44, they didn't find old wiring or rat damage. The system was intact. However, they found a modification, a crude bypass rigged to steal electricity from the main grid without spinning the meter. It was amateur work, dangerous work, the kind of setup that would cause the lights to dim and flicker whenever a heavy appliance was turned on. This implies two things. One, the flickering wasn't a ghost, it was physics. Two, someone was inside that house, alive enough to need power, but desperate enough to steal it to avoid a paper trail. If the owner had truly fled the country 15 years ago, then who was risking electrocution to keep the lights on? The neighbors thought they were ignoring a ghost. In reality, they were ignoring a signal. And there is one final chilling observation from the investigator's notebook. The bypass wire was wrapped in black electrical tape. The tape was relatively new. It hadn't been there for 15 years. It had been replaced recently. Someone has been maintaining the darkness by controlling the light. But if the owner is the victim found decomposing in the living room, then who fixed the wiring in the basement? In the dead of night, sounds in this alley don't just echo, they linger like unwanted guests. During the initial interviews, 3 different residents mentioned the same specific detail, but they all mentioned it as an afterthought, a throwaway line in a sea of useless information. They talked about a strange noise at 2 o'clock in the morning. Scrape, step, scrape. The distinct, rhythmic sound of worn-out plastic slippers dragging across rough concrete. At first, the neighbors dismissed it. One claimed it was just the wind rattling the loose corrugated iron on the roof. Another insisted it was just the stray cats knocking over trash bins. It is easier for the human mind to invent a harmless explanation than to confront a terrifying reality. But cats do not walk with a heavy, uneven rhythm, and the wind does not stop specifically in front of the gate of the deserted house. Investigators went back to the timeline.
They cross-referenced the nights when this sound was reported with the physical evidence found inside the living room. Do you remember the newspaper found on the coffee table, the one we discussed in Part 4? It was dated just 2 weeks prior to the discovery of the body. The house was supposed to have been abandoned for 15 years, yet the newspaper was fresh. The connection hit the investigation team like a bucket of ice water.
The sound of dragging slippers wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a hallucination. It was a visitor. Someone had been coming back. The timeline suggests that on the night of the 14th, around 2 a.m., the perpetrator returned to the scene, not to hide evidence, but perhaps to check on their secret, to sit in that suffocating room amidst the smell of decay and read the daily news. The dragging sound implies a few possibilities. Perhaps the visitor has a limp, or perhaps they were carrying something heavy, something that weighed them down as they approached that rusted gate. But here is the detail that truly chills the spine. It isn't the killer's return that is most disturbing. It is the neighborhood's reaction. Multiple people heard that sound. They heard the gate creak open in the middle of the night. They knew no one was supposed to be there, yet not a single light turned on, not a single curtain moved. They lay in their beds listening to the scrape, step, scrape, and chose to pull their blankets higher. Their silence was not born of fear, but of a cold, collective apathy. They didn't want to get involved, and because they refused to look out the window, a monster was allowed to walk freely through the shadows. But if the killer felt safe enough to return 2 weeks ago, why did the lock suddenly need to be broken today? What changed? In the chaotic theater of a criminal investigation, the loudest voice is often just distraction. We spent the last 2 episodes dissecting the life of the debt collector, a man whose fists were permanently clenched and whose alibi was as porous as a sieve. He was the perfect villain, aggressive, indebted, and violent. But in the monochromatic light of the interrogation room, perfection is suspicious. He was too obvious. He lacked the patience for a crime that required 15 years of silence. So the detectives turned their gaze away from the shouting man and focused on the quietest corner of the canvas. They looked at the woman who had been standing at the periphery of the crime scene since day 1, Mrs. Gable. You remember her, the sweet, elderly widow living 2 doors down, the one who brought iced tea to the locksmiths when they first broke the seal, the one who collapsed in tears, crying the loudest when the smell of death finally wafted out of that open door. To the neighborhood, she was the pillar of kindness, the lonely grandmother who watched over the street. But in a homicide file, lonely is just another word for unaccounted for. Routine procedure required a cursory check of the trash bins of all immediate neighbors. It was supposed to be a formality. What could they possibly find in the waste of a 70-year-old woman who lived alone? Perhaps some expired coupons or withered flowers? Instead, investigators found a crumpled receipt from a hardware store 3 towns over. The date stamped on it was just 2 days before the locksmiths arrived. The items listed were dissonant. Men's heavy-duty shaving cream, a pair of size 11 rubber boots, and 3 rolls of industrial-strength duct tape. Mrs. Gable has been a widow since 1998. She has no sons, no grandsons who visit, no live-in caretaker. Why does a woman who barely walks to the mailbox need men's grooming products?
And more importantly, why drive 45 minutes to a store in a different district to buy them, paying strictly in cash? Suddenly, her behavior over the last decade takes on a different hue. We thought her constant presence at the window was the melancholy of old age. We thought her habit of chasing children away from the abandoned house fence was concern for their safety. We were wrong. It wasn't loneliness. It was surveillance. It wasn't safety. It was containment. When the police sat her down for a second interview, the tears were gone. The trembling hands were stilled. The mask of the harmless old lady didn't slip. It simply dissolved. She didn't look like a grandmother anymore. She looked like someone who had been holding a heavy door shut for 15 years and was simply tired of the weight. We often say that walls have ears, but in this alley, the eyes watching the house didn't belong to a ghost. They belonged to the neighbor everyone trusted. But a receipt is just paper. It proves she bought the items, but it doesn't prove why. Until the forensics team decided to spray luminol not in the abandoned house, but on Mrs. Gable's pristine kitchen floor. And that is when the real nightmare began to glow. It wasn't found in a safe. It wasn't hidden behind a loose floorboard. The most damning piece of evidence in the Blackwood case was rotting in a black plastic bag, buried under 15 years of compost and debris in the backyard shed. A leather-bound journal. The cover was warped by moisture, smelling of mildew and something else. Something faintly sweet, like cheap lavender perfume. When investigators peeled the damp pages apart, they didn't find a confession, not at first. They found what looked like the ramblings of a concerned neighbor. The handwriting was elegant, precise, the kind of penmanship you expect from a sweet, elderly woman like Mrs. Gable. The early entries, dated 6 months before the disappearance, paint a picture of admiration. She watched Mr. Blackwood from her second-floor window. She noted his schedule. She worried about his skipped meals. She called him a lost soul in need of guidance. To the untrained eye, it reads like kindness. But a detective looks for the cracks. And the cracks appear on page 23. The ink presses harder into the paper. The loops of the letters become jagged. This was the week Mr. Blackwood brought a woman home, the mysterious lover mentioned in the police report. Mrs. Gable didn't just note it, she dissected it. She describes the woman as a contaminant, a distraction. The tone shifts violently. The narrative moves from a neighbor looking out for him to a woman obsessed with saving him from himself. This is where the psychological profile turns dark. We see the classic saver complex warping into the captor. In her mind, Mr. Blackwood wasn't a grown man making his own choices. He was a wayward child who needed to be disciplined. She writes about repairing his fence, not to keep intruders out, but to ensure he stayed in. She didn't want him happy. She wanted him isolated, dependent. Hers is one entry, written just 3 days before the house went silent, that makes the air in the room turn cold. "He refused my soup again," she wrote. "He shouted at me through the screen door. He doesn't understand that hunger is the only way to purify the spirit. If he won't listen to reason, he must be made to listen to silence. Hunger. Remember the empty pantry we found in Part 4? The scratches on the inside of the kitchen door. The neighborhood spent 15 years praising Mrs. Gable for watching over that empty house, calling it loyalty. The diary reveals the terrifying truth. She wasn't a caretaker. She was a warden guarding a cell. But the journal ends abruptly. The final page has been torn out, leaving only a jagged edge of paper. However, tucked inside the back cover was something the police almost missed. A faded, yellowing receipt from a hardware store, dated the very afternoon Mr. Blackwood was last seen. She didn't buy a weapon. She bought 3 items: a bag of quick-drying cement, a heavy-duty padlock, and a single high-voltage light bulb. Why would a woman obsessed with darkness buy a light meant for an interrogation room? The answer lies in the basement. In the sterile, white light of the forensic laboratory, there are no ghosts. They're only residues, chemical compounds, and timeline discrepancies that refuse to align with the narrative we've been fed. When the forensics team swept the house at the end of the alley, they expected a time capsule, a sealed tomb, untouched since the night the owner supposedly fled his debts 15 years ago. They expected dust to be uniform. They expected decay to be natural. But the microscope told a different story. They found epithelial cells, skin flakes, on the handle of the bedroom door. They found a single gray hair on the back of the velvet armchair facing the master bed. And most damning of all, a partial fingerprint on a glass of water sitting on the nightstand. A glass that still had water in it. The DNA didn't belong to the victim. It matched the reference sample taken voluntarily from the neighbors for elimination purposes. It belonged to Mrs. Gable, the elderly, sweet-tempered woman who lived 3 doors down, the one who had brought iced tea to the officers on the first day of the investigation, the one who cried on camera about how much she missed the poor, unmisunderstood homeowner. But here is where the air in the room turns cold. DNA degrades. Fingerprints fade. Yet the traces found on that armchair weren't 15 years old. They weren't even a month old. According to the degradation analysis, those skin cells were deposited yesterday. Let that sink in. For 15 years, the neighborhood believed that house was a rotting, abandoned shell. Children were dared to run up to the porch. Rats were assumed to be the only tenants. But the house was never empty. Detectives pulled the footage from a neglected security camera covering the back alley, a camera installed by a paranoid shopkeeper weeks ago but never checked. At 2:14 every single night, a shadow moves. It's not a ghost. It's Mrs. Gable. She doesn't break in. She doesn't pry a window open. She takes a key out of her pocket, a key that shines under the moonlight. She unlocks the back door with the familiarity of a wife coming home from work.
Inside the house, the investigation takes a macabre turn. The shrine wasn't just a figure of speech. The dust in the hallway wasn't disturbed by intruders, it was swept. There was a clear path walked through the filth, leading straight to the room where the bodies lay. Mrs. Gable wasn't hiding the bodies, she was visiting them. She was the caretaker of a tomb she helped create.
We often talk about the criminal returning to the scene of the crime, but this is obsession. This is possession. For 15 years, she maintained a relationship with the dead. She dusted around them. She sat in that velvet armchair night after night, staring at the decomposition, perhaps talking to them, perhaps scolding them. The horror isn't just that they died. The horror is that they were never allowed to leave. When police raided Mrs. Gable's apartment this morning, they found a small wooden box on her vanity. Inside, neatly labeled, were the spare keys to the abandoned house. And underneath them, a diary. The entries didn't stop 15 years ago. The last entry was written 2 days ago. It read, "He was very quiet tonight. The house is finally ours." We thought we were investigating a murder for money. We thought we were looking for a runner. But we were looking at the wrong kind of hunger. But if Mrs. Gable had the keys, and she was visiting every night, why did she let the demolition crew in? Why allow the secret to be broken now? Unless she wanted them to be found. Or perhaps she wasn't the only one with a key. Fade out. The flashing red and blue lights sliced through the midnight drizzle, painting the narrow alley in bruised colors. There was no siren wail, no dramatic chase, just the heavy, rhythmic tread of muddy boots on wet pavement approaching the house directly opposite the crime scene. The neighborhood was silent, save for the hum of the police radio and the distant barking of a dog, a sound that had plagued this street for years, now suddenly seeming like a warning no one had heeded. When the squad car pulled up to Mrs. Gable's residence, the front door was already unlatched. Mrs. Gable didn't look like a monster. She looked like exactly what the neighborhood believed her to be, a lonely 60-year-old widow who baked cookies for the street and organized the block parties. When Detective Miller entered the living room, she was waiting. She sat in her floral armchair, hands resting gently on her lap, perfectly still. On the table next to her, a cup of tea had gone cold. Miller didn't shout. He simply walked over and placed an evidence bag on the coffee table. Inside, sealed in plastic, was a single rusted brass key. The spare key to the house at the end of the alley. The key that had been missing for 15 years. Most suspects scream when the evidence lands. Some cry, begging for a lawyer. Others shut down. Mrs. Gable did none of these things. She looked at the rusted key with a tenderness that made the officer's skin crawl. A soft, almost motherly smile spread across her face. "I see you found him," she whispered. "Not it. Him." In the sterile, fluorescent-lit interrogation room an hour later, the air was thick enough to choke on. The camera zoomed in on her hands, withered, spotted with age, yet steady. She spoke of the victim, Mr. Blackwood, not as a man she had bludgeoned, but as a bird she had caged for its own safety. She explained, her voice melodic, possessing a chilling calmness. The gambling debts, the loan sharks, they were going to hurt him. He told me that night. He told me he was going to run away, to leave us. The detective leaned forward. "So you killed him?" Mrs. Gable frowned, as if insulted by the word. "I protected him. If he ran, they would have found him. They would have broken him." She leaned back, her eyes glazing over with a terrifying delusion. I kept him safe. For 15 years, he has been right there, across the street, quiet, peaceful, mine. The horror of the confession wasn't in the violence, it was in the domesticity of it. The investigators suddenly realized the truth behind her habits. The way she always sat on her porch, facing the alley. The way she aggressively scolded children for playing near that abandoned door. It wasn't civic duty. It was a warden guarding her inmate. She hadn't been ignoring the smell of decay that drifted across the street all those years. She had been savoring it. It was the scent of her possession. As she was led away to the holding cell, she didn't ask for mercy. She only asked if the house would be locked up properly. But as the heavy steel door slammed shut, echoing through the precinct, Detective Miller remained at his desk, staring at the autopsy report. The fatal blow to the back of the skull, it had crushed the parietal bone completely. It required significant, brutal force. Miller looked at the photo of Mrs. Gable's arthritic hands. Then he looked at the hammer found in her tool shed. It was heavy.
Too heavy for a woman of her stature to swing with that kind of velocity, even 15 years ago. Mrs. Gable was the architect of this nightmare, certainly. She possessed the motive and the madness. But looking at the physics of the blow, a cold realization settled in the pit of the detective's stomach. Someone else had to have swung that hammer. Let's turn the clock back. October 14th, 15 years ago. The weather forecast predicted a tropical depression, but no one expected the deluge that would drown the city that night. It was the kind of rain that creates a wall of white noise, isolating every house in the alley into its own little island. Perfect for a crime that requires privacy. Inside the house, the scene was set not for a murder, but for a celebration, a farewell dinner. The investigation team found the receipt for that bottle of wine, an expensive vintage, far beyond the landlord's means at the time. It was a gift, a gesture of goodwill from her. Picture the scene, the warm yellow light of the dining room, the steam rising from the bowls, the clinking of glasses. The landlord and his creditor believed they had reached a settlement. They believed the money was coming. But the only thing waiting for them was dissolved in that wine. It wasn't a poison that killed instantly. That would have been too merciful. It was a heavy sedative. The transition from laughter to silence wasn't abrupt. It was a slow, terrifying slide. First, the slurred speech, then the numbness in the limbs. The realization didn't hit them until the landlord tried to stand up to answer the phone, and his legs simply refused to obey. He crumpled to the floor, knocking over a chair. That was the only loud noise made inside the house that night. Now, look at her, the perpetrator. She didn't attack them. She didn't use a knife. She simply sat there, watching them struggle against their own weight. The coldness here isn't in the violence, it's in the patience. She waited until their eyes were the only things that could move. She stood up. She didn't run. She walked to the sink, washed her own glass, and dried it with a towel. She turned off the stove. She unplugged the refrigerator. Why unplug the fridge? Because she knew no one would be opening it again. Then came the walk to the door. The victims were conscious. The autopsy confirmed no brain damage prior to death. They were awake. They watched her put on her raincoat. They watched her step out into the storm. They tried to scream, but their vocal cords were paralyzed, reducing their cries to nothing more than wet, guttural chokes. Click. The deadbolt slid home. Click. The padlock on the iron gate snapped shut. Outside, the rain hammered against the tin roofs of the alley, a deafening cacophony. The neighbors, the kind people living just a wall away, later said they slept soundly. Perhaps they did. Or perhaps in this alley, when you hear a strange thud or a muffled groan in the middle of the night, you don't investigate. You turn up the volume on your television. You pull your blanket tighter. You choose not to know. She walked away into the rain, leaving two living souls trapped in a box that was slowly running out of air. But the reconstruction reveals one detail that doesn't fit the perfect crime narrative. If she intended to disappear with the money and leave them for dead, why did the forensic team find the back window unlatched? Just a crack. Not enough to escape, but enough to let the air in. Was it a mistake? Or was it hesitation? We are left with the final question, the one that leads us to the grim discovery in the basement. If the house was locked from the outside, how did the third body get inside? 3 months after the final verdict was read, the excavator's claw finally tore down the last standing wall of the house at the end of the alley. The structure that held 15 years of silence, decay, and a man's decomposing body is now nothing more than a flat, vacant lot covered in gray gravel and aggressive weeds. You would think the demolition would bring peace to the neighborhood. It didn't. The neighbors, those kind-hearted folks who spent a decade and a half confidently weaving stories about the owner fleeing from debt, now avoid looking at the empty space. I watched them from a distance yesterday. When they walk past the alley entrance, they subconsciously quicken their pace. They don't talk about him anymore. It is as if by erasing the physical structure, they hope to erase their own indifference. But notice their eyes when the wind blows from that direction. It is not just dust they are squinting against. It is guilt, and perhaps a lingering fear that the dead do not leave just because their house is gone. The perpetrator is behind bars, serving a life sentence for a crime born of sudden greed and sustained by cold calculation. Justice, on paper, has been served. But the case file of the abandoned house leaves a heavy aftertaste that no judge's gavel can strike away.
The most terrifying aspect of this investigation wasn't the murder itself, nor the gruesome state of the remains when we found them. It was the time. 15 years, 5,475 days. That is how long a man lay dead while life continued uninterrupted just a few inches of brick away. People cooked dinner, watched television, and complained about the weather, completely unaware, or perhaps willfully ignorant of the cold reality rotting next door. And that brings us to the question that keeps me staring at the ceiling at 2 in the morning. Walk through your own city tomorrow.
Look at the houses with the shutters drawn tight. Look at the gates rusted shut, the mailboxes overflowing with yellowed flyers, the apartments where the lights never seem to turn on. We call them abandoned. We tell ourselves comfortable lies. The owners moved overseas. They're tied up in legal battles. They simply walked away. But are they really empty? Or is there someone else in another house at the end of another alley, waiting in the dark, waiting for a knock that never comes? As I left the scene for the final time, the sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the rubble. The air was still, unnaturally so. And there, sitting exactly where the front door used to be, was a stray cat. It wasn't scavenging for food. It was just sitting there, perfectly still, staring at empty space, waiting for its master to come home.